Hello and welcome to The Mirror. This is episode number 5, and I'm just back from FiestaCon, which also doubles as WesterCon this year, WesterCon number 62. And I was fortunate enough to get an interview with the editor of Analog magazine, Dr. Stanley Schmidt. And we'll cut immediately without wasting time directly to the interview. Hope you enjoy it. Hello, I'm speaking to you from Tempe, Arizona at the site of WesterCon 2009. My special guest today is Dr. Stanley Schmidt. Welcome, Dr. Schmidt.
Thanks for inviting me.
Dr. Schmidt is the editor of Analog magazine, one of the major magazines in speculative fiction. And Dr. Schmidt, how does a person who spends all that time and energy to earn a PhD in physics end up editing a science fiction magazine?
Well, actually the physics and the science fiction are tangled up in each other because a major reason that I got interested in going into physics was through science fiction that I read in my tykehood. And I never started off with the commitment of devoting myself entirely to one thing. I was actually starting to write and sell stories while I was a graduate student in physics. I knew I wanted to learn a lot about physics and work in it. I also knew I wanted to write science fiction. The thought had also crossed my mind that John Campbell had an awfully neat job. It never occurred to me that I might have it sometime, but I sold my first stories during graduate school when I was working on my doctorate in physics. I wasn't sure whether I was allowed to be doing it, but I did it anyway. And after I'd been selling stories for about 10 years and meanwhile teaching physics, Ben Bova, who had succeeded John as editor of Analog, decided that he would like me to replace him, and it sounded like too much fun to pass up, so I took it.
Oh, congratulations on that. Where did you go to school, and what area of physics was your specialty?
Well, undergraduate was University of Cincinnati. Grad school was Case Western Reserve. And as far as my research was concerned, I had one foot in solid state and one in nuclear. My thesis research was on Nussbauer effect studies of intermetallic compounds of tin, which means that I was using a nuclear effect that only happens in solids to study the structure of those solids. The Nussbauer effect is a thing that I won't attempt to explain in a few minutes, but it can be used to measure extremely small energy changes. It's been used, for instance, to experimentally confirm the gravitational redshift predicted by relativity over a distance of just 60 vertical feet.
That sounds very interesting. You also did some teaching. Are you still doing any teaching, or are you fully engaged into the world of writing and editing now?
Well, teaching is a very major part of editing, as I see it, because to me the most satisfying part of editing is discovering and developing new writers. So I think it was Ben Bova possibly who defined what an editor's job is to recognize a writer who hasn't learned to write yet and help him or her do that. So in a way, I haven't really left teaching. What I've instead gotten into is a kind of teaching that probably every teacher has secretly dreamed about on bad days. I only have to spend time on those students who I think are worth it. Those include some of the brightest and most highly motivated people in the world.
You've talked a little bit about how you became editor of Analog. Is the experience the same? Is it what you expected, or how is it different?
It's somewhat as I expected. I had worked with both John W. Campbell and Ben Bova before, including visits with them, so I had some idea what the offices looked like and what went on there. There were some surprises. For instance, I suspect, like many beginning writers, when I started out, I sort of had the idea that the world was full of ordinary people who would find it very hard to ever sell anything, and established writers who were a special breed who automatically sold everything they wrote. And one of the first things I learned as an editor is that nobody is in top form all the time. You name somebody, I've rejected them. But also the way the job happens has evolved over the years, of course. For instance, we are now produced largely using desktop publishing. We do most our copy editing and proofreading and typesetting have all merged into one step that happens in our office, not back and forth with somebody in New Hampshire. And writers no longer send in typed manuscripts and keep carbons. In fact, we now assume that people are going to be writing on computers, and we no longer maintain the staff to retype manuscripts as we used to have to.
So let's say a writer sends you a submission and you decide that you want to buy the story. What is the journey that story is going to take to appear in Analog?
Well, first of all, let me take this opportunity to emphasize that although email makes it much easier for the writer, or makes it a little easier for the writer to submit a story, if we let everybody do it, it would make life a lot harder on our end, so we don't do it. So please don't bother to email us a submission. Don't send it on disk unless we ask for it. We will definitely ask for it after we buy the story. So what happens when I get a story on paper with a self-addressed stamped envelope? That no longer has to be a self-addressed stamped envelope to return the whole manuscript, because most people don't want their manuscripts back anymore, and frankly I prefer it when they don't, because I like to be able to make marks on it as I read. I read everything, and I either buy it or send it back. Regrettably, 98 to 99% of everything I get goes back, because I only have room for 1 to 2% of it. And sometimes I'll see something that's almost what I want but not quite, so I will write a letter, sometimes quite a long letter, explaining what bothers me about it and challenge the author to come up with a way to fix it so that we both like it better. Then if we buy it, then we will ask for an electronic copy that can be used for typesetting. And this is to the author's benefit too when we have it at this stage, because if we have an electronic copy rather than somebody in our office having to retype the manuscript, there's a lot less chance for errors to creep in. Of course, the downside of that from the author's point of view is that mistakes that are there, you probably had there in the first place.
I'm sure that you get a lot of stories that maybe aren't appropriate for Analog, but you really enjoy reading. Is it difficult to reject those because they don't fit the expectations of your readers?
Not really. I guess it was a little at the beginning. At the beginning, it was also tempting to try to write personal critiques on way too many things. And I was fortunate enough to inherit a very capable associate editor from Ben Bova, Victoria Shockett, who, after she watched me for a couple of weeks, said, "You know, if you don't start using those form letters we provided you with, you're never going to get caught up." And she was right. So but most of these writers are friends of mine now, but you have to keep the personal and professional completely separate. My job is not to provide checks for everybody who wants one, or even teaching or writing instruction for everybody who wants it. My job is to fill the magazine with stories that readers are going to want to keep paying to read. And if I have to send something back because it doesn't seem to me as being in the 1 or 2% most likely to do that this month, there's never anything personal in it, but I don't lose any sleep over it either.
There's a fairly close relationship between Analog magazine and Asimov's magazine. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, it's not really as close as you might think. The close relationship is that we are owned by the same publisher, and their office is down the hall, and their editors and our editors are all friends, and we talk to each other. But the editing of the two magazines is completely independent. There's no consultation between us. no attempt to coordinate what we do. Once in a great while, if one of us reads something that we think that is not right for us, but the other might have a good chance of liking, we'll pass it over. But we like that to be at our decision, not the writer's request. In general, we won't do it. It makes life too complicated. And besides, if you really want your story landing on my desk and the first thing I see is Sheila's rejection.
Well, you're known mainly for your editing work with analog. You're also a writer, and could you tell us a little bit about your writing and where it fits into the spectrum of speculative fiction with hard SF on one end and high fantasy on the other?
Well, actually, not all of it is fiction at all, as a matter of fact. If I may be forgiven a small plug here, my latest book, which is currently in print, is this one, The Coming Convergence, which has the lengthy subtitle attached to it by the publisher, The Surprising Ways Diverse Technologies Interact to Shape Our World and Change the Future. So it's nonfiction. I think of it as history of science merging into futurology. But the subject matter is very much what we think of as science fictional, but it's about what has already happened and what's likely to happen in the real world. As far as my fiction is concerned, as I hinted earlier, I was writing mostly for Analog for 10 years before I became its editor. I'm often typecast as a hard science fiction writer, by which I am frequently mildly dismayed to find that people mean something rather different from what I mean.
What is your definition of hard science fiction?
When I say hard science fiction, I simply mean that there is some element of speculative science or technology in it that is so integral to the story that you can't take it out without making the whole story collapse. That is, it's not just background, it's incidental. Or, there should be a reasonable attempt to make that plausible. That is, you ought to be able to convince the reader that it's something that just might even be able to happen. Now, where people go wrong, in my opinion, and mischaracterize what I do, is that they interpret this as meaning science fiction, which is based closely on careful extrapolation of the science we already know. And I've almost never done that. I use certain forms of faster-than-light travel quite freely, for instance. The secret is that I have invented new forms of science to explain how they might be possible. But to invent new forms of science, you have to understand old science. I think the reason people have come to think of me as that closely conservative kind of hard science fiction writer is that, being a physicist, I speak physics well enough to lie convincingly about the invented science that I've concocted for a story, so that you can't tell where the real ends and the invented takes up. A physicist can, but if you're not, you might not notice if I've done my job right. But yeah, I tend to try to meet those two criteria that I mentioned, make something integral and plausible. This does not mean that the emphasis is primarily about the science. The stories, like all stories, are about people. For instance, this series here, which was my first two novels, well, not exactly. The Sins of the Fathers and Lifeboat Earth are a two-part series that I did back in the 70s. They have some really wild speculative science in them, but the story is about what might happen to human life and other life as it happens if these things actually happened. And my most recent novel was this one, Argonaut, which came out just a few years ago. And that has what at first glance appears to be some wildly fanciful science in it too. But on the other hand, if you look at it on a different level, this could be seen just as a wild extrapolation of something that's actually happening to us at great speed right now.
Okay. One of the questions that I'm asking all my guests, and I'm in particular interested in your response based on your background, is there has been some discussion in the science fiction or the speculative fiction community of the more and more irrelevance of science fiction, or maybe the death of science fiction as we know it, and I'm wondering what your take on that is.
Well, I've been hearing things like this for decades, and as far as the death of science fiction as we know it, well, an ongoing process for as long as science fiction has existed. So science fiction as we know it is always turning into science fiction as we don't know it. And I fully expect that process to continue. I mean, to say that science fiction is irrelevant because so much that it has written about in the past has already come to be or been demonstrated that it's not likely to, well, that just means those aren't our subject matter anymore. The world is still changing faster than ever. There's still going to be science fiction. I can't tell you what it's going to be about because it's going to be about things that we haven't thought of yet.
Where do you see the genre going in, say, the next decade?
The decade's a pretty long time these days, so I can't really say. I suspect that the printed version of it is going to probably continue to dwindle, and the electronic versions or forms are likely to become more important. But this is still so much in a state of flux that I wish I knew how it was going to pan out, but I don't.
Is there anything that you're seeing come into analog that you'd like to see more of, something that's really underrepresented given today's world?
I think really good biological science fiction, biotechnology. There are a lot of writers who try to work with this, and my biologist friends tell me that they don't get it right nearly as often as they should. So that's where a lot of the scientific action is now, and the science fiction writers should be trying to keep ahead of it.
And one last question. Do you think that it's more difficult today to write science fiction than it was in the past, based on the speed that science is changing and the specialization and the specific knowledge that's necessary to understand the cutting edge these days?
Yeah, I think it would be hard to argue with that. And also, I think it's become harder in another way, too, that there are so many people doing it now, and so many people have done it well already, that what's expected of a writer on all levels, both literary and scientific, is quite a bit more than it used to be. So it's a fun field to work in, but if you're trying to get into it, you're up against some really rough competition, and there aren't nearly as many slots to go around as I wish there were.
Okay, well, thank you very much for agreeing to the interview, and I'm sure that the viewers also enjoyed this little visit we had. Okay. Thank you very much. Well, that was Dr. Stanley Schmidt. Thank you very much for the interview. And now for the news segment. Unfortunately, I was unable to come up with any news items that were worthy of snarky comments. They were all pretty boring announcements of novels and that sort of thing. So instead, I thought maybe we would do a little bit more entertainment for you. And so here we go. Nah, let's not do this. I want you people to come back and watch episode number 6. So, that's all we have for today. Until next time, bye-bye.